"Who told you to take that music?" Graham Bellamy snapped, his hand halfway to the yellowed sheet as Caleb Whitaker stood frozen beside the old church piano, one hand still on the lifted lid. Lily, 9 years old and barely tall enough to see over the bench, slipped her fingers under her father's sleeve and pointed at the page before Graham could snatch it away. Across the aisle, Eleanor Vance had already gone pale, her gloved hand rising slowly to her mouth as the first 3 notes Caleb played hung in the air like something fragile and impossible. The room did not move. The piano sounded warmer than it had any right to sound. And Graham, wearing his polished smile like a vest, said too quickly, "That's just an old hymn sheet. Nothing worth keeping." Lily looked up at him and whispered, "Then why are you so scared of it?" 3 hours earlier, the church basement smelled like dust, lemon polish, and old wood softened by years of prayer. Caleb had been there before sunrise, kneeling beside the piano with his toolbox open, a worn rag tucked into his back pocket, the sleeves of his blue flannel rolled to the forearms. He worked without a crowd, without praise, with the calm patience of a man who knew how to make broken things useful again. Outside, autumn wind moved along the stained glass windows with a thin, mournful hiss, and inside the sanctuary, fluorescent lights buzzed over folding chairs stacked against the wall. Caleb tightened a tuning pin, tested the key, then paused when he heard Lily behind him, her small shoes tapping softly on the tile. She held out a cup of water with both hands. "You haven't sat down," she said. He gave her a tired half-smile, took the cup, and glanced toward the piano's side panel, where one seam sat a little too clean, a little too perfect, like someone had hidden a repair beneath another repair. "Your hands are shaking," she added, not unkindly. "Not much," he said, but she was right. He had not slept much since Marjorie died, and every extra dollar he spent on rent, school supplies, or groceries felt like a nail pulled from the same thin plank holding his life together. Still, he kept working. That was what men like Caleb did. They fixed what they could reach. He set the cup down, leaned closer to the piano, and heard it again. A strange hollow click beneath the pedal board, too soft to be a fault, too sharp to be nothing. At the top of the stairs, voices drifted down from the sanctuary. Graham's voice came first, smooth and measured, the voice of a man who sounded helpful even when he was deciding what to erase. Eleanor's followed, lower and quieter, carrying a weariness that had money behind it and grief beneath it. "We're only trying to protect her legacy," Graham was saying. Caleb didn't look up, but Lily did. Her eyes moved from the piano to the hallway and back again, as if she could feel a secret pressing from the inside. Caleb set his palm on the wood, feeling the vibration fade, and noticed a thin sliver of paper tucked just inside the seam near the pedal frame, bent once, then flattened carefully, as if someone had hidden it there and expected no one ordinary to ever notice. It was smaller than a receipt, older than a program, and on the corner, faint as breath on glass, was the same little mark from the sheet music on the stand. The little scrap of paper Caleb had seen in the piano seam was still trapped between his thumb and forefinger when Graham Bellamy turned back from the aisle and smiled as though nothing unusual had happened. "That's maintenance noise," he said softly, already smoothing the moment over with that polished churchboard voice. "Old wood settles. Old paper moves. We don't need alarm." Eleanor Vance did not answer him right away. She only looked at the yellowed sheet on the music stand, then at Caleb's hands, then at the tiny torn corner of paper caught in the seam of the piano like a secret trying not to be found. "Old paper doesn't usually match a hidden mark," Caleb said, quiet enough that it sounded less like a challenge than a fact. Graham's smile tightened for just a second. "Mr. Whitaker, this is a place of worship, not a workshop debate." "Then let him finish looking," Lily said, small but clear, her fingers still wrapped around Caleb's sleeve. "Honey," Graham replied, his tone kind in the way a closed door can be kind. "Grown folks are speaking." The room shifted in small, uncomfortable ways. A woman in the back lowered her bulletin. Someone coughed into a fist, and one of the ushers glanced at Caleb's scuffed boots as if they had just walked mud across polished floor. Caleb did not lift his chin. He only slipped the paper scrap into his shirt pocket and set his wrench down on the bench with care, as though any sudden sound might break something that was already cracked. The church sanctuary smelled like old hymnals, floor wax, and the faint citrus scent Eleanor wore like a memory she had not yet decided to share. The overhead lights hummed above them, pale and steady, making every face look a little more tired than it wanted to admit. Graham stepped closer to the music stand and rested one hand on the edge of the piano, as if he owned the room through good intentions alone. "We appreciate your help," he said, loud enough for the people nearest the front pews to hear. "But repairs of this nature are normally handled by certified contractors, not by—" He let the sentence fade with a pleasant little shrug, the kind that could insult a man without leaving a bruise. "Not by who?" Lily asked before Caleb could stop her. "By men who know how to fix things?" A couple of people looked down, not wanting to be part of the moment and not brave enough to leave it. Graham bent slightly, smiling at the child as if she were adorable furniture. "By professionals, sweetheart. Which is why we've asked Mr. Whitaker to step back while we discuss the next steps." "Next steps for what?" Caleb asked. "For the piano," Graham said. "And for the church's liability." That word landed hard. Liability. Not the piano. Not the music. Not the history. Just liability. Caleb finally looked up, and in his eyes there was no anger to feed on, only the tired steadiness of a man who had been blamed before for things he had not broken. "I haven't touched anything that would make it worse," he said. "No, but you have touched enough," Graham replied, still smiling. "And we can't risk a disaster because someone wanted to be helpful." Eleanor's gloved fingers tightened once on the edge of her purse. She still wasn't defending him, not yet, but her gaze had gone to the small torn paper in Caleb's pocket, then back to the seam of the piano where he had found it. It was the first time she had truly looked at the instrument instead of through it. Caleb heard the soft scrape of a chair as one of the board members shifted away from him, giving him the same distance people give a stain they hope will not spread. The piano bench creaked when Lily moved closer to her father, and the child's face lifted, not with fear, but with the kind of quiet loyalty children wear like a coat when the weather turns against the person they love. Caleb laid one hand lightly on her shoulder, then took the other hand and placed it flat against the piano's side panel, feeling the faint vibration under the wood. It was wrong. Not broken in an ordinary way. Wrong in a way that suggested something had been hidden, sealed, and then covered over with care. Graham watched that hand too long. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, still courteous, "if there's nothing else, we really should let the ladies prepare for the trustees' meeting." The words sounded clean. The intent did not. A trustee meeting meant documents, signatures, and decisions made in rooms where men like Caleb usually waited outside doors. Eleanor's expression changed by a degree so small only a person watching carefully would have noticed it. Something about Graham's timing had touched the wrong nerve. Something about how quickly he wanted the piano cleared had made her eyes narrow. Caleb saw it. He did not smile. He simply reached into the pocket of his flannel and drew out the tiny folded paper he had found in the seam, careful not to unfold it yet. At the corner, just visible against the light, was the same small mark from the music sheet, faint but deliberate, as if whoever hid it had wanted it to be found only by someone who knew where to listen. "This came out of the piano," he said. Graham's pleasant face stayed in place, but his jaw moved once before he answered. "Then it's probably just a maintenance note." Caleb looked down at the scrap, then toward Eleanor, whose eyes had fixed on the mark with a concentration that made the room feel suddenly narrower. "Maybe," he said, "but if it is, why does it feel like someone wanted it hidden from her?" Caleb did not hand the scrap to Graham. He did not raise his voice either. He simply folded the tiny paper once and tucked it into his shirt pocket as if it weighed more than its size could explain. Then he glanced at Eleanor, whose face had gone still in that careful, expensive way people learn after too many disappointments, and he made a choice that none of the men in the room seemed to expect. He stepped away from the piano, reached into the pocket of his blue flannel, and took out the small plastic sleeve he kept for receipts, notes, and parts lists. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I think this belongs with you, not with him." Graham let out a short, polite laugh that carried no warmth. "Mr. Whitaker, there's no need to turn a church repair into drama." Caleb did not answer him. He crossed the aisle, boots soft on the worn carpet, and held the folded scrap out with both hands the way you might offer a fragile thing back to the person it was taken from. Eleanor looked at the paper, then at his face, then down again at the tiny mark in the corner. Her gloved fingers hovered for a second before she took it. The room felt smaller the moment she touched it. Lily came up beside her father without speaking, her thumb brushing the side of his hand, a quiet child's way of asking whether this was safe. Caleb gave her a nearly invisible nod and turned back to the piano. One key near the middle had gone slightly off after all the attention, not broken, just stubborn, and he pressed it once, then again, listening to the wobble in the tone. People were still watching the exchange, waiting for him to either argue or retreat, but he only opened his toolbox and pulled out a thin felt strip and a narrow tuning wrench. He had learned long ago that broken things often told the truth through sound before they told it through words. While he worked, the church air changed in small ways. The faint citrus of Eleanor's perfume, the old wax on the floor, the cool breath drifting through a side door that did not shut properly. Somewhere above them, the heating unit clicked and settled, then clicked again. Graham moved closer, his smile still in place, but there was impatience beneath it now. "This is not your meeting," he said. "The trustees are waiting." "Then let them wait a minute," Caleb replied, not looking up. He slid the felt strip into place, tightened the pin by a fraction, and tested the key again. The note came back cleaner this time, steady and honest. Lily watched his hands, not because she understood piano work, but because she understood his face. When his jaw tightened, it was never for himself alone. He was thinking about the school office where she would be waiting after dismissal if he was late again. He was thinking about the rent envelope he had left unopened in the truck because he already knew what it would say. He was thinking about Marjorie, too, and about how she used to say that a man's worth never lived in the size of his paycheck, only in what he chose to protect when no one was clapping. He pressed the key one last time and the note held without wobble. It sounded, for one brief second, like something repaired in more than one way. Eleanor saw it. Not the repair alone, but the care in it. The man had not rushed. He had not taken the easy credit. He had not used her grief as an opening. He had returned something that did not belong to him and then fixed what he could still fix while everyone else stood around deciding who mattered. She turned the scrap over in her hand. The little mark in the corner looked less like decoration now and more like a sign that repeated itself on purpose. Graham noticed her looking too long. "Eleanor," he said gently, "we should really let the lawyers handle the archives." "Maybe," she said, though her voice stayed soft, almost private. But he found this inside the piano. Graham's expression tightened, just a flicker, but enough. Old churches collect all kinds of debris. Caleb lifted his eyes at that, not sharply, just enough to make Graham notice he had been heard. "Debris usually doesn't match the same mark on the music sheet," he said. Lily, still beside him, noticed the shift in the room before anyone else did. The board members were no longer looking at Caleb like a repairman. They were looking at him like a man who had done one small thing too carefully to dismiss. One woman near the front lowered her folder and stared at the piano seam where the paper had come from. Eleanor unfolded the scrap at last, just a little, and when her eyes moved over the handwriting, her breath caught so softly that only those nearest her heard it. Caleb saw that tiny change and understood immediately that the scrap was not merely old. It was personal, important enough for someone to hide, important enough for someone else to fear. He did not ask what it meant. He only took the wrench back to the bench and placed it beside the other tools in precise order, as if order itself might help the truth stay together long enough to be found. Then he glanced at Lily's hands, red from the cold, and without making a show of it, unbuttoned his flannel and draped it over her shoulders. She smiled up at him, small and trusting, then slipped one hand into his sleeve and held on. That simple motion, that warm weight of a child believing her father had room enough to keep standing, seemed to settle something in Eleanor's face. She looked from the girl to the man to the torn paper in her own hand, and for the first time her gaze no longer held only grief. It held recognition. Because Caleb had not tried to win the room, and because he had protected a clue he could have used, the first real crack had opened in the wall Graham had built. And Eleanor, watching the man who returned what others tried to take, began to suspect that the truth hiding inside the piano was not hiding from him at all. It was waiting for someone like him to unlock it. Caleb had only just put the wrench back into his toolbox when Graham Bellamy stepped between him and the piano, smiling the way a man smiles when he wants the room to believe he is helping everyone. "Let's not turn this into a misunderstanding," Graham said, his voice soft enough to sound reasonable and firm enough to sound final. He reached for the folded scrap in Eleanor's hand, but she kept it close to her chest. "Mr. Whitaker did what he thought was right," Graham continued, now speaking to the room rather than to her. "That does not mean we can let an unverified piece of paper disrupt a trustee meeting." A few heads turned. A few people nodded because it was easier than thinking. Caleb stood still beside the piano bench, his shoulders level, his hands empty, his face calm in that way that made him look more dangerous to dishonest people than any raised voice ever could. Lily stepped half a pace closer to him, her fingers catching the edge of his sleeve. She was quiet, but her eyes stayed on Graham. In the back of the sanctuary, one of the board members cleared his throat and asked, "Wasn't that note already inside the piano when we arrived?" Graham answered too quickly. "The instrument has been open to the public all week. Anyone could have tucked something in there." He said public like it meant safe, but his hand had already moved to the piano lid as if to close it again before anyone else could look. That was when Caleb noticed the first clear wrongness. Eleanor had set the scrap of paper on the music stand beneath the sanctuary's brass lamp, and in that narrow wash of light the tiny mark in the corner was no longer vague. It matched the archive stamp on the church's old record shelf exactly, down to the slight tilt of the line through the symbol. Caleb did not touch it. He only leaned in and looked, his gaze fixed and careful. "If it was public," he said, "why does the mark on this paper match the storage stamp from the archive room?" The room went quieter by degrees, not all at once, but like a staircase descending one step at a time. Graham's smile remained, but the skin beside his jaw tightened. "Old churches reuse symbols," he said. "That proves nothing." "Maybe not by itself," Caleb said. "Then let's ask the paper a second question." He reached over, adjusted the lamp by a few inches, and the light struck the edge of the fold. A pale crease line appeared, sharp and fresh against the older yellowing of the paper. Someone had opened and refolded it recently. Not years ago. Recently. Eleanor saw it and inhaled so softly that the sound almost vanished. Caleb did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the crease and on Graham's hand, which had frozen half an inch from the piano lid. "That fold is new," Caleb said. Graham gave a light laugh that sounded more practiced than amused. "Well, of course it is. The note was found today." "No," Caleb said, still quiet. "Found and folded are not the same thing." He turned the paper slightly and the edge caught again, revealing a faint smear of wax along the crease, the kind left by a sealed envelope or a document handled with old fingers and careful habits. Not everyone saw it, but Eleanor did. Her eyes moved from the wax to Graham's cuff, where a matching fleck of pale sealing residue clung near the seam. It was tiny, almost nothing, the kind of thing most people would miss if they were not watching for lies. Lily noticed the way Eleanor's gaze stopped on Graham's sleeve. The little girl frowned and tugged once on Caleb's sleeve, then whispered. He was standing there before the lights went out. Caleb looked down at her. "What lights?" Lily pointed toward the side hall leading to the archive room. "The ones by the papers. They blinked off when he went in." The adults around them shifted again. A woman near the aisle looked up sharply. Graham's voice remained controlled, but it had lost a little of its ease. "A child's impression is not evidence." "No," Caleb said, "but it is a direction." He finally turned toward the side hall. The archive room door stood half closed, and a thin ribbon of yellow light spilled from the gap beneath it. The smell coming from that direction was not paper and dust alone. It was something sharper, almost metallic, as if a metal file drawer had been opened and shut in a hurry. Caleb walked to the doorway with the same measured pace he used when approaching a damaged circuit or a weak floorboard, and when he reached the threshold he stopped. In the small window cut into the door, the corner of a filing cabinet was visible, and the cabinet top was bare except for a single old envelope with one side slightly torn, as though it had been pulled out too fast and shoved back in just as quickly. He did not touch it. He simply stood there, listening. Inside the room, a drawer slid shut. Graham's reflection in the door glass appeared behind. Caleb, close enough to suggest he had followed, but not close enough to prove anything yet. "Mr. Whitaker," Graham said, and now his polite tone had gone thin. "You should not be wandering into restricted areas." "Then maybe," Caleb replied, keeping his eyes on the envelope inside the archive room, "you should explain why the same mark is on the note, the same wax is on your cuff, and the archive drawer sounds like it was opened 5 minutes ago." Nobody spoke for a moment. Eleanor's hand tightened around the scrap. The board member in the front row leaned forward. Lily looked from her father to the door, then back to Graham, as if she could feel the air change even if she did not understand every reason why. Graham opened his mouth, closed it, and then said with careful irritation, "You are reading too much into a coincidence." Caleb's answer was almost too soft to hear. "Then why did you just come back from the archive room?" The question hung there, simple and clean, with nowhere respectable to hide. Graham did not answer it. Instead, he stepped sideways, putting himself just enough between Caleb and the door to suggest a boundary without admitting he had one. Eleanor noticed that too. And because she noticed it, because she saw the wax on the cuff and the fresh crease in the note and the slight delay in Graham's response, the room began to tilt toward a truth nobody had named yet. Caleb kept his hand on the doorframe, his posture steady, his breathing even. He had not won anything. He had only shown the room where to look. But as the archive drawer clicked once more inside the half-lit room, and Graham's smile failed for the smallest possible instant, Caleb understood that the first clue was not just the paper. It was the fact that someone in this church had been hiding it long enough to think the hiding place would never be opened. The half-lit archive room stayed quiet for a beat after Caleb's question, and that silence made Graham Bellamy look less composed than he wanted to be. Then he exhaled a short laugh, the kind that tries to sound generous while it warns everyone not to look too closely. "Fine," he said, smoothing one sleeve with his thumb. "If there's confusion, let's do this properly. We follow procedure." He turned toward the side hall, where a young church secretary stood with a clipboard pressed to her chest and said, "Bring the maintenance log and the most recent invoice. The original ones, not the copies." The request sounded reasonable. That was what made it dangerous. Eleanor did not move right away. She kept the torn scrap of paper in one gloved hand and looked at Caleb as if asking a question she did not yet know how to say aloud. Caleb answered without words, only with a small nod toward the archive drawer and then toward the piano room, where the old instrument waited under the brass lamp with one side panel slightly ajar. Graham followed his gaze and immediately stepped in front of it, as if a body could become a curtain if it stood in the right place. "No need for everyone to get excited," he said. "This is all very ordinary." Lily, still close to her father, looked up at him and whispered, "It doesn't feel ordinary." Caleb lowered his hand to her shoulder once, steady and warm, and said, "Stay where you can see me." The secretary returned with a dusty ledger wrapped in string and a thin envelope marked piano service. It was the kind of paperwork that smelled faintly of old ink and dry paper, of offices no one had entered in months. Graham took it first, but Eleanor held out her hand. "Here," she said, not harshly, not loudly, just enough to make him pause. For the first time since Caleb had found the note, Graham looked like a man whose plan had to wait in line. Eleanor opened the ledger on the bench under the lamp, and Caleb leaned in without touching it. The page numbers were off by one. He saw it immediately, not because he was trying to catch someone, but because he had spent years fixing things where small mistakes became big failures if left alone. The last page had been reinserted recently. The staple at the top was shinier than the rusted ones around it. "This page was added," Caleb said quietly. Graham gave a practiced shrug. "It's an old book. Pages shift. Caleb pointed with one finger. Not when the staple is new. The room tightened around that sentence. Someone in the back stopped whispering. The air conditioner, which had been a soft background hum, suddenly sounded louder, like a machine noticing it was being listened to. Caleb turned the page gently and found the invoice underneath, carbon copy on thin paper, the kind that leaves blue pressure marks where a pen has pressed too hard. The date was 3 days after the church had supposedly removed access to the piano. The signature at the bottom was slightly slanted left, a habit that matched no one's handwriting on the board list. But what Caleb saw next mattered more. The line item for soundboard inspection had been crossed out and written over in a different ink, not corrected but disguised. Who changed this line? He asked. Graham's answer arrived too quickly. Probably an office error. Eleanor looked up. An office error does not move a date 3 days forward. Caleb turned the invoice just enough to catch the light. A small indentation on the paper became visible near the margin, as if another document had once rested on top of it when the ink was still wet. A receipt beneath a receipt. A hidden copy. Something filed where it should not have been. He did not smile. He did not announce victory. He only asked, who had access to this ledger? Graham's mouth opened, then closed. Several people. Name them, Eleanor said. Her voice was still soft, but something hard had entered it. Graham glanced at the secretary first, then away, and that was when the first real crack appeared in the room. He had just given away that he did not actually want names. He wanted time. The secretary, to her credit, turned pale and put one hand on the back of a chair as if the floor had shifted under her shoes. I logged the invoice myself, she said, but only after Mr. Bellamy asked me to file the updated copy. Updated copy. Caleb heard the words and looked down at the original again. The original was the one with the wrong date? No. The original was the one with the hidden correction. The updated copy was the cleaned version. That meant someone had wanted the paper to say one thing in the room and something else in the file. Eleanor's eyes sharpened. File it where? She asked. The secretary hesitated and then pointed toward the archive room behind them. In the lower drawer with the donor records. Graham's posture changed at once. It was tiny, almost invisible, but Caleb saw it. One heel shifted half an inch back, one shoulder angled just enough to guard the doorway. Not guilt exactly. Control. He was no longer trying to look calm. He was trying to keep people from seeing what the paperwork led to. Caleb walked to the doorway and, without putting himself in anyone's way, held the archive drawer open with 2 fingers. Inside was a plastic folder, its edge bulging with papers. He pulled it out and found, tucked behind the service log, a second sheet with the same handwriting as the note in the piano seam. Not the full truth. Not yet, but enough to show a chain. A donor record, a maintenance schedule, a transfer note, all tied together by the same faint mark in the corner. This is not church paper, Caleb said. Eleanor stepped beside him now, close enough to see the mark and the matching crease. No, she murmured. It isn't. Graham's face held, but only barely. Those are administrative documents. They prove nothing. Caleb set the folder on the bench and tapped the invoice with one knuckle. Then why were they hidden with the service log? The secretary looked from him to Eleanor, then back at Graham. Her confusion was turning into something more uncomfortable. The room had stopped breathing in the same rhythm. People had begun to understand that the issue was no longer a piano problem. The piano had only been the door. Lily, who had been silent through all of it, looked at the service log and frowned. This line is different, she said, pointing to the one that had been crossed out. It says somebody came before the lights went off. Caleb turned toward her. Before the lights went off? She nodded. I heard the click in the hall. Then the lamp by the papers got dark. Then he told me to go stand by you. Graham said her name once, too sharp, and Lily flinched. Caleb put himself between them without moving fast enough to look like a threat. She's telling you what she saw, he said. Not accusing. Not dramatic. Just a fact placed on the table. Eleanor looked at the invoice, then at the drawer, then at Graham. The tiny fold in the paper, the fresh staple, the corrected date, the hidden donor sheet, the child's memory. All of it began to line up in a way that had nowhere else to go. Her hand tightened around the scrap until the edge creased once more. Caleb noticed and, for the first time, understood the first clue had not been the note itself. It had been the paperwork that proved someone had already been preparing a different story long before anyone heard the piano sing. And as Graham glanced toward the archive drawer again, just once, Caleb realized the original invoice was not the end of the paper trail at all. It was the first door in a hallway leading to whoever had told Graham what to hide. The folder on the bench proved to be heavier than paper had any right to be. Caleb slid the hidden sheet from behind the service log and found, beneath it, a donor record folded twice and stamped with the same tiny archive mark Eleanor had already noticed on the note. It was not a random storage symbol. It matched the church's restricted access filing system, the kind used only for records tied to private gifts, legacy pledges, and donor instructions that were never supposed to be discussed from a pulpit. Eleanor turned the page slowly, and the color drained from her face when she saw her husband's initials in the margin, written beside a line about instrument preservation and restricted transfer pending trustee review. Graham's hand moved at once, not quite reaching, just hovering as if he could physically stop the words from being read. That was old bookkeeping, he said, a little too fast. It has nothing to do with the piano repair. Caleb looked at the page, then at the service log, then back at Graham. Then why are all three documents filed together? The room went quiet again, but this time it was the quieter kind, the one that comes right before people decide they are no longer comfortable pretending. The church secretary, still standing by the archive door, swallowed hard and said, "There's camera footage from the hall outside the records room." Graham turned to her so sharply that the movement itself felt like a confession. "There is no need to pull more people into this." Eleanor raised her head. "Show it." The secretary hesitated, then reached for a small tablet mounted on the wall cradle near the copier. The screen took a second to wake, then displayed the grainy black and white feed from the hallway outside the archive room. The timestamp in the corner was clear enough to read, 8:14 p.m. The sanctuary lights had already gone dim. On the screen, Graham appeared first, stepping into the hallway with a keycard in one hand and his phone in the other. He looked over his shoulder before entering the archive room, not like a man curious about old files, but like a man checking whether anyone was watching him check the files. Lily leaned toward Caleb and whispered, "That was before the lights blinked." Caleb nodded once without taking his eyes off the screen. On the footage, Graham opened the archive room, stayed inside longer than he should have for someone supposedly only checking paperwork, and emerged with a thin envelope tucked under his arm. He did not look relieved. He looked hurried. He looked like a man leaving a scene before it could be rewritten. Then, with a motion so small it almost vanished, he slid something into his jacket pocket and closed the door with his elbow. The video did not show the envelope's contents, but it did catch the corner of a second sheet as it bent against his sleeve. The same corner mark, the same paper stock. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the donor record. "Run that again," she said. Graham's face remained carefully composed, but one bead of sweat appeared near his hairline and stayed there, bright under the sanctuary light. "Eleanor, we really do not need to make a spectacle of a staffing issue. Run it again," she repeated. The secretary did, this time slowing the footage. Caleb stepped closer to the screen without touching it. He was not a man trying to trap anyone. He was a man trying to verify what his hands had already suspected. At the slowed frame, the envelope's return label flickered into view for less than a second. It bore the name of a donor foundation Eleanor recognized instantly, and beneath it, in smaller type, the phrase, "Legacy Instrument Directive." Not a church note, not a maintenance note, a formal instruction connected to a trust. Eleanor's breath caught, and this time it was not just grief. It was recognition of a pattern. "That's my husband's foundation," she said softly. The room reacted all at once, but quietly. A chair leg scraped, someone's hand slapped a folder shut, and the air itself seemed to pull tighter. Graham smiled, but the smile had slipped into something brittle. That doesn't mean anything. Donors send all kinds of papers. Not to a restricted archive at 8:14 at night, Caleb said. He kept his voice level, but the words landed with enough weight to make the copier hum in the corner sound suddenly too loud. Eleanor looked from the tablet to the donor record to Graham's jacket pocket, and the line connecting them became visible in her face before anyone said it aloud. This was not one altered page. This was a method, a system, a repeated habit of moving papers before people could see them. The secretary, now pale, opened the next folder and found 3 more invoices behind the first, each one with a corrected date and a different overwritten line item. One had soundboard inspection, replaced with temporary removal approval. Another listed a pickup time that matched the night before the piano side panel was found slightly open. Caleb did not use the documents to shame anyone. He only laid them in a neat row on the bench, like pieces of a machine taken apart for inspection. These weren't filed by accident, he said. Someone kept changing the story until it looked safe enough to sell. Graham's jaw moved once. You're making assumptions. Caleb's eyes stayed on the papers. No. I'm reading the paper you forgot to hide. The phrase drew the smallest, sharpest breath from Eleanor, because she saw it too now. This was not only about the piano. It was about an entire chain of documents being reshaped to make a legacy disappear quietly, one correction at a time, until the church itself stopped remembering why it mattered. Her husband had left more than a song. He had left instructions, protections, and a warning. Graham had either ignored them or buried them. And whichever one it was, the result was the same. Eleanor turned the donor record over and found a second note on the back, written in her husband's hand, smaller than the rest but unmistakable to her. She did not read it out loud. She did not need to. Her thumb passed over the ink as if touching his signature could pull the truth all the way up from the paper. Caleb saw the change in her face and understood that the larger truth was not only financial. It was personal, and it had been handled by someone who thought grief would make a widow easier to manage. At that, Eleanor finally stepped out from behind the edge of the table and placed the donor record in full view, right under the lamp, where no one could pretend it was an old curiosity. This is no longer a private misunderstanding, she said, her voice low but carrying. Then she looked at Graham and added, if you have an explanation, you will give it where the board can hear it. The room did not move, but it had clearly changed shape. Caleb felt it in the stillness, in Lily's hand finding his sleeve, in the secretary's frightened glance toward the hallway, in Graham's abrupt decision to check his phone as though a message might rescue him from the evidence on the table. It would not. Not now. The papers were no longer on his side of the story. They were on the table, under light, and the only place left for this to go was out in front of everyone. By the time the church basement filled for the special board session, the folding chairs had already been set in rows under humming fluorescent lights, and the old radiator in the corner clicked like a nervous metronome. Eleanor had asked for the meeting herself, and that alone had changed the temperature in the building. Men who usually arrived late came early. Women who usually whispered stayed silent. The donor record, the service log, and the archive folder sat together on the long table beneath a single brass lamp. Each sheet clipped flat as though even paper now knew it had to behave. Caleb did not take the center seat. He stood near the wall with Lily at his side, one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, the other empty and open. Graham Bellamy sat across from them in a navy suit that still looked precise, though the collar had begun to crease under the heat. He had arranged his face into concern before anyone else arrived. We're all here because confusion was allowed to spread, he said, addressing the room with the calm tone of a man who had already rehearsed his innocence. And because a simple maintenance issue was turned into something it never needed to be. A few board members nodded at the word maintenance as if it were a rope to hold onto. Graham continued. The piano was scheduled for transfer due to liability. The archived papers were mishandled, and Mr. Whitaker, despite his good intentions, has read far more into this than any reasonable person should. He gave Caleb a brief, almost pitying glance, the kind that tries to make a man feel small without breaking the rules of public speech. Caleb did not answer. He only shifted Lily's chair a little closer to the wall, so she would not have to sit in the center of the room. That simple movement seemed to matter more than any speech because it told everyone he was still protecting her first. Eleanor watched that, then looked back at Graham. "Let's begin with the sheet music," she said. The secretary stepped forward and placed the folded note from the piano under the lamp. At once the room recognized it, or rather recognized the feeling it carried, because the first thing Eleanor had done when she saw it in the sanctuary was whisper that song. Now, under brighter light, the tiny corner mark was visible again, and the room could see why Caleb had not let it go. "This note was inside the piano," Eleanor said, "and it matches the archive mark used on restricted donor records." Graham's smile did not disappear, but it thinned. "That proves only that old church marks were reused in old filing systems." "Then explain why the fold is fresh," Caleb said from the wall. His voice was low, even, and tired in the way of a man who had already heard too many people call truth an inconvenience. Graham turned to him as if correcting a child. "Because paper bends when it is handled." "Not like that," Caleb replied. He did not move forward. He did not raise his voice. He simply pointed with 2 fingers at the note. "The crease is new. The wax is new. And the paper stock matches the donor folder, not the hymnal box." The secretary swallowed and looked down at the service log as if it might protect her from being asked questions. Eleanor slid the log toward herself and turned 1 page. The corrected date was still there, the overwritten line item still visible under the lamp. "This invoice says the piano was inspected on a night when access to the archive room was already restricted," she said. "That is not a misunderstanding. That is a contradiction." Graham leaned back a fraction. The first retention spike came when he chose the smoothest lie possible. The system was updated late. 2 files were entered out of sequence. "We can correct the paperwork without making this public." Several heads lifted at once. That was the line, the one designed to sound merciful. "Let's not make this public. Let's handle it quietly. Let's be civilized. Let's keep everyone comfortable." Caleb looked at Graham for a long moment, then answered with a sentence so plain it carried farther than a speech. "Quiet is how this got buried." No one spoke after that. The radiator clicked. Someone in the back shifted in a folding chair and the legs scraped softly against the tile. Lily looked up at her father, then at Eleanor, then at the note beneath the lamp. She had been asked to stay out of the adult's way, but there were moments even children could bridge with simple memory. She lifted 1 finger and pointed at the archived hallway plan pinned on the wall near the copier. "That was where the light went out," she said. "Right there by the papers." Graham's gaze flicked to her so fast it was almost invisible, but Eleanor noticed, and so did Caleb. "What papers?" Eleanor asked. Lily kept her voice small and steady. "The man in the nice suit took one when he came out of the room. He was holding it like this." She held her own small hands in a careful rectangle, mimicking the shape of a folder. A murmur moved through the chairs. Graham's expression remained controlled, but one hand slid down to cover the edge of the donor folder on the table. That was his first real tell. A person who had nothing to hide does not guard paper like a weapon. Eleanor turned toward the secretary. "Show the footage again." The screen on the wall flickered to life. The camera angle from the hallway outside the archive room came back into view, grainy and gray, the timestamp still locked at 8:14 p.m. Graham entered. Graham exited. Graham looked over his shoulder. Graham carried the envelope. The footage was short enough to seem harmless until the room watched it a second time and saw what Caleb had seen earlier. Graham did not leave empty-handed. He left with something tucked under his arm that had not come from the piano repair at all. "That envelope," Eleanor said, her voice tightening. "Was it catalogued?" The secretary hesitated. "It was logged only after Mr. Bellamy requested the updated copy." That sentence was enough to begin the second retention spike. Graham's own version of events had just collided with a witness statement and a timestamp. He tried to recover at once. "I requested the updated copy because the original had errors. That's all." Caleb stepped off the wall only 1 pace, not to dominate the room, just to be close enough to the table to place the donor record beside the note. Then why are the errors always in the same direction? He asked. He opened the archive folder and, one by one, slid the documents forward. Donor record, service log, invoice, transfer note. Each one carried the same small mark. Each one had been corrected in a way that favored removal, not preservation. This isn't random, Caleb said. The paper keeps telling the same story. Graham laughed once, but the sound had gone dry. And what story is that exactly? Caleb's answer was gentle enough that no one could accuse him of grandstanding. That someone wanted the church to stop asking where the music went. Eleanor stared at the documents, then at Graham, and the way she did it made the room feel as though it had moved one step closer to a cliff. She was no longer merely grieving. She was reading a pattern, and patterns once seen are hard to unsee. Graham looked at the table, then toward the side door, then at his phone, which vibrated once in his pocket and went still. The movement was tiny, but Caleb saw it. The phone meant someone else was waiting. Someone else had been kept informed. The thought did not need to be spoken to alter the air. Eleanor reached toward the archive folder and drew out the last sheet inside, the one tucked deeper than the others, the one with the same handwriting as the note from the piano seam. She had not opened it yet. Graham noticed that too, and for the first time a vein at his temple began to pulse. Eleanor, he said carefully, there are proper channels for this. She looked up at him with an expression so quiet and so fully awake that it made the whole room still. Then this will be handled through the proper channel, she said, holding the envelope just above the table. Starting with whatever is inside this one. And as every face in the basement turned toward her hand, Graham's eyes followed the envelope with a fear he could no longer hide. Eleanor Vance broke the seal with both thumbs, and the paper gave a dry little snap in the silence that had gathered over the basement table. Inside the envelope was not one document but three. The original donor directive on heavy cream paper, a folded repair receipt from the church basement piano service, and a small black audio card tucked between them like something hidden by a hand that knew exactly how to be forgotten. Graham Bellamy straightened so quickly his chair legs screeched across the floor. That should not be in there, he said, but the words came out thinner than he intended. Eleanor did not look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the first page, where her husband's signature sat beneath a typed instruction that was now impossible to pretend away. The piano was to remain in St. Mercy Chapel, preserved for worship and community use, and any transfer required her direct approval. The room seemed to inhale all at once. A few people leaned forward. Someone near the back covered their mouth. Caleb stayed where he was, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the table. Lily pressed close enough that her shoulder touched his hip. He did not smile. He did not move toward the papers. He only looked at Eleanor and waited for her to read the next line. Graham's throat worked once. That document is an outdated draft, he said. It was superseded. Eleanor turned the page and found the second piece of proof. A repair receipt, dated the same week as the archive log, showing Caleb's name on the church service work order, and a notation that the piano had been opened only for tuning and restoration, not removal. The handwritten initials in the margin matched the secretary's entry. Then she looked at the audio card. "What is this?" she asked quietly. For a moment nobody answered. The church basement had gone so still that the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights sounded almost like weather. Then the secretary, pale and shaken, whispered, "It came from the archive envelope. I thought it was a file card." Graham's hand went to his mouth and then back down again, as if he had nearly made the mistake of showing fear where the room could see it. Caleb finally stepped closer, not toward Graham, but toward the small player docked beside the copier. "Play it," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a weight in it that made the board members stop shifting in their chairs. Eleanor looked up at him once, and in that look there was no question of whether to trust him anymore. There was only the harder question of whether she was ready to hear what had been hidden from her. She inserted the card. The screen flickered. A soft burst of static filled the room, then a breath, then the low crackle of old compression, and then a man's voice, warm and unmistakable, carrying the faint echo of a room much like this one. It was her husband's voice. For 1 second Eleanor did not move at all. Not even her fingers. The recording began with a little rustle of paper, then the sound of a piano bench shifting, then the first familiar notes of the song Caleb had played only minutes earlier, not polished, not grand, just the kind of melody a husband writes when he knows exactly who he is singing to. A few people gasped before they could stop themselves. Then the voice on the recording said her name. Eleanor, if you are hearing this. Then the piano stayed where it was supposed to stay. Her hand flew to her mouth, but she did not cry out. She simply listened. The voice continued, calm and deliberate, explaining that he had left the piano in the church because it belonged to the people who had prayed under it, sung beside it, and built their lives around its sound. He said Graham had been warned in writing not to remove it. He said a trust amendment had been placed inside the archive envelope in case the first copy was ever hidden. And then he said very plainly that if anyone told her the piano had been sold for the good of the church, it would mean the truth had been traded for convenience. Graham shut his eyes for one brief second. That was the second silence payoff, the one that hurts because it arrives after the first one has already broken the room open. On the recording, Eleanor's husband chuckled softly at something off microphone, and then the piano began to play again, a short phrase of the same song, this time clear enough that everyone recognized it as the exact melody Eleanor had heard only when grief first punched through her chest. The room froze completely. Even the radiator seemed to stop clicking. The song hung in the air with such tenderness that no one dared interrupt it. Eleanor's face changed in slow stages. Shock, then recognition, then a sorrow so pure it looked almost like relief. He kept it, she whispered, barely audible. Caleb heard her and lowered his gaze, because this part was not his to claim. The recording ended with a final instruction. If the piano ever needed proof of belonging, the archive mark on the donor records would match the initials in the old service log, and the church's own footage would show who entered the restricted room and who left with the envelope. The secretary immediately brought up the security clip again, and the screen on the wall showed Graham entering the archive room with his keycard, exiting with the envelope, and glancing toward the camera only after he had tucked the file under his arm. No one laughed now. No one even breathed loudly. When the clip paused on the frame of his hand on the door, the phone in Graham's pocket began to ring. It rang once, then stopped, then rang again. He stared at it as if it were something that had betrayed him. Caleb looked from the screen to the phone to the donor directive and said nothing. He did not need to. The evidence had already stacked itself high enough to stop the room from arguing with reality. Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief moment, and when she opened them again, they were steady. She placed the donor directive flat on the table, one palm on either side of it, and said, "This was not a misunderstanding. This was a concealment." Graham's face had gone gray around the edges. His mouth opened, but what came out first was not defense. It was damage control. "Eleanor, I was trying to protect the church from conflict. By hiding my husband's final instruction?" she asked. "By changing the file dates?" He had no answer that could survive the papers, the footage, and the song. The board members were no longer watching Caleb. They were watching the documents, and then Graham, and then Eleanor, waiting for the decision they already knew had to come. She turned to the secretary. "Lock the archive room. Preserve everything. No one touches another page until council reviews it." The secretary nodded too fast, relieved to have instructions that did not require loyalty to a lie. Then Eleanor looked at Caleb. For the first time since the sanctuary, her gaze held not grief alone but gratitude sharpened by recognition. "You found this because you listened," she said. Caleb lowered his chin once. "I just fixed what I could reach." It was a small answer, but it carried more dignity than any speech in the room. Lily slipped her hand into his and squeezed, her body finally loosening now that the air no longer felt dangerous. Graham looked at the child, then away, then at the board, and the movement in his hands gave him away more than words could. He was no longer the man controlling the meeting. He was the man waiting for the meeting to control him. Eleanor lifted the repair receipt and the donor directive together, and the room understood that the piano, the song, the archive folder, and the footage were all part of one long chain of deliberate deception. Then she said the sentence that moved the entire basement from suspicion into consequence. "We will handle this publicly, through the board and the court if necessary, and we will do it before another story is buried." No one objected. No one could. The evidence had become too complete, the silence too deep. Caleb looked down at Lily, at her small fingers folded around his sleeve, and for the first time that night he let himself breathe. But even then he did not ask for anything. He did not look at Eleanor as if a reward were due. He simply stood there with his daughter, the repaired receipt still on the table, the recording still warm in the air, and the question waiting behind his eyes. Now that the truth had finally been heard, what would he choose to do with the space it had made?